Everybody, in our age of the Epstein files, it seems everyone has access to all the dirtiest secrets in the world. I even went to the DOJ site and I found 3 references to myself. Not that I ever spoke or met Jeffrey Epstein. In previous ages, scandal was harder to dig out. In the age of President Nixon, of course, and of Henry Kissinger, it's much harder to get to the files, the phone calls, the data. But my guest today has indeed done that. Tom Wells is the author of the Kissinger tapes, inside his secretly recorded phone conversations. And Tom Wells is joining us from east of Albuquerque in New Mexico. Tom, congratulations on the new book.
Thank you.
What do you make of our Epstein age? I'm less interested in your ideas on Jeffrey Epstein himself and on the idea that his files, his tapes now seem to be accessible by everybody, in contrast with the age of Nixon and Kissinger.
Well, generally speaking, I'm for releasing as much information as possible. So that would include the Epstein files and certainly include Kissinger's phone transcripts.
Tell me more about these tapes. I'm sure a lot of our viewers and listeners aren't even aware that Kissinger secretly recorded his phone conversation, especially in a post-Watergate America. It seems a little odd. Why did he do this?
Well, I think primarily for 2 reasons. One is I think he wanted the material for his memoirs. He needed the record for his memoirs, and also I think he needed this stuff to stay organized. He wasn't the most organized person in the world, and I think the phone transcripts allowed him to keep tabs on what he told to who, when, and what obligations he had. And I think he also wanted to get like some of his colleagues on the record. In case that they wanted to back away from their positions they'd taken with him. I think he wanted to protect. I think he also wanted to protect himself against leaks. So he would have himself on the record for stuff. So he was trying to cover himself, but I think primarily he wanted the material for his memoirs. And if you look at his memoirs, he used his phone transcripts heavily. I mean, there's whole sections of his memoirs parallel his phone transcripts. But again, he also needed to stay organized, and I think his phone transcripts helped him do that.
Tom, you're the author of The War Within, America's Battle Over Vietnam. You're clearly on the progressive side of things. I'm guessing, at least in the context of Vietnam, you're not a great fan of Henry Kissinger. Did you come to this project as the Nixon tapes project, as a Kissinger hater, as a skeptic, or did you come open-minded?
I came as someone who was very critical of Henry Kissinger because of his policies, primarily his policies in Vietnam and the mass killing of civilians in Vietnam, a result of his and Nixon's policies. And in other areas in the world. And so I've always been critical of Henry Kissinger. I came to, respect him and admire him in other ways. I mean, he was an incredibly hard worker. He had incredible stamina. He was able to balance a lot of things at once without, losing it. He had some real talent. He's very smart. He was very good at dealing with the bureaucracy in which he operated. So I mean, he and I think in his diplomacy, he was really good at keeping knowing how what he said to one party would affect his relationships with another party, and he was very good at keeping a lot of issues in mind when he was pursuing his negotiations. I mean, plus his stamina, I'm sure, helped him enormously, through these long negotiations. But so, I mean, I came to really respect some of the things he did and can do and his capabilities. But on the other hand, his policies I've always had a big problem with. particularly in Vietnam, but also in other areas. Supporting the Pakistani military government that carried out a genocide in East Pakistan. His involvement in the secret wiretaps of government officials and journalists. That he was really the prime force on those wiretaps. And then he repeatedly lied about it afterwards. He said he didn't request any wiretaps on anybody. Didn't have anything to do with the decision to conduct wiretapping, and also his role in the secret bombing of Cambodia and the false reporting system that they used, to carry that out. And then afterward, he just kept lying about it. He kept saying he didn't know anything about a false reporting system. He had nothing to do with how the military conducted its reporting. He never told them to engage in false reporting. So, that was one of the things I learned during the course of going through his phone transcripts and writing the book, was he actually lied more than I thought he did.
And I'm guessing you probably thought he lied a lot, so he must have lied a considerable amount. Tom, a huge amount has been written on Henry Kissinger. Again, I'm sure you've read most of it. And you've written your own stuff. Is there something in the Kissinger tapes that we didn't know? Is there breaking news about Henry Kissinger that will shock or scandalize admirers or critics of Kissinger?
Well, one of the things that struck out to me looking at the Vietnam transcripts was how callous Kissinger was and Nixon was to the civilian casualties. You can see him in there, taking great gratification about all the dead bodies piled up following bombing strikes in Vietnam. Their callousness really.
Explain that. Do you mean in private calls he was making jokes about dead Vietnamese civilians?
They weren't making jokes about it, but they were like reveling in it. They were talking about, Kissinger say stuff like, if they just dropped the bombs out the door without even aiming anything, they'd have to have hit something. It's those kind of statements. And they talk about like 350, they found 350 bodies piled up following a bombing strike. And Nixon actually said, I don't care about the civilian casualties. And he said during the Laos invasion, which was an invasion by South Vietnamese troops supported by American air power and artillery, Nixon said, I don't even care if they lose the 10,000 South Vietnamese that are in Laos now. It's that level of callousness that's just stunning. I knew these guys, that morality was not really part of their calculation. They're looking at Nixon and Kissinger were both looking at the big geopolitical game, right? And Kissinger tended to see most conflicts within the context of the U.S. rivalry with the Soviet Union. And he would talk, he talked about it in terms of the balance of power in the world.
Tom, Nixon, of course, Kissinger is famous for he was a professor of history at Harvard for many years and a theorist of realpolitik. I think his great heroes were Metternich, the architects of realpolitik in the 19th century. To what extent is this what you call this callousness about civilian casualties in Vietnam? Is it a reflection of realpolitik versus just an odd kind of indifference to human suffering?
Well, I think it's a reflection of what you're talking about, his general approach to foreign policy. And also, I think, a reflection of his ambition personally, to carry out the policies and to achieve the results he's trying to achieve. So he's willing to look the other way in terms of the human cost of his policies. But I think generally what you're talking about, his kind of general approach to foreign policy, it's a product of that. But he was also, he was very ambitious, and he really was, he looked out for Henry Kissinger, and he was certainly trying to, achieve certain things foreign policy wise. And I think that, he looked the other way when it came to, morality and the human toll, a lot of this stuff.
Although, again, I'm not sure that's huge news. Last year we had Edward Luce, the Financial Times' man in D.C., he has a wonderful new biography of Zbigniew Brzezinski. I'm sure you've seen it, Zbig, in which he places Brzezinski very much in parallel with Kissinger. They were, in a sense, rivals, but they also had different notions of America's responsibility, moral responsibility in the world. In your Nixon tapes, does he recognize moral criticism or moral critics? Does he defend his position? Are there conversations with people like Brzezinski who didn't share his view of the world?
I don't recall his conversations ever really talking about morality, except insofar as he might say something to the effect that, that's not morality is not the issue. The issue is the balance of power and U.S. national interests. And I don't think he saw morality in the sense that we're talking about it as part of his pursuit of American national interests as he saw them. I think he looked more at the American role in the world and its power and his ability to use its power. He was not shy about using American power. That was much more important to him than morality. I mean, it wasn't even. It's not even.
Did you? I mean, you listened to these tapes. How many of them were there?
No, what he did is the tapes don't exist anymore. What he did is, he had his secretaries and other people. Eventually, and at first they were just listening into these phone conversations and taking notes, right? And then they started producing fuller transcripts of these conversations, and then shortly he set up, phone recordings a system. But what he said was that the phone tapes themselves were destroyed shortly after they were transcribed.
Okay, but my question is then, okay, so maybe you didn't listen to all of them, but you read many of them. You've invested significant amount of time in it. What kind of man was Kissinger? What wisdom can you bring on this, Tom, for historians of this period, and Kissinger in particular? Is there some sort of interpretation? You just think he was ambitious, he was hardworking?
No, he was very skilled at what he did, and in terms of how he saw the world and how he saw American interests. He was very skilled at achieving the results he was trying to achieve, partly because he was so smart and he was very good. He was a very good bureaucratic operator. He had tremendous stamina. His work ethic, his work hours he worked incredibly long hours, and he seemed to do this day after day, and he didn't seem to require a lot of sleep.
So, but I take your point. You've already talked about his work ethic. What were his ultimate ambitions? Did he want to be recorded in history as the Mitterrand, the great man of the last part of the 20th century?
Yeah, I think he wanted to be remembered as a tremendously, skilled and successful foreign policymaker. And again, a lot of that was basically, asserting American power and American standing in the world as he saw it. And and thwarting the Soviet Union, limiting Soviet increases in Soviet influence around the world. That was certainly a big part of it. And like I said, a lot of these areas in the world where there are conflicts, he's tended to see them in terms of the U.S.-Soviet rivalry and limiting Soviet influence. And he tended, in some cases, to exaggerate, how much influence the Soviet Union had. For example, in Vietnam, he thought, the Soviet Union had more influence over the North Vietnamese than they did by far. The same thing during the India-Pakistan conflict. I think he thought the Soviet Union was influencing India more than they were. And in other areas, he was always looking at basically what's happening with the Soviet Union. What are they trying to do? I mean, at one point, like in Jordan, there was a Palestinian uprising in 1970. And, Kissinger was very attuned to what possible role the Soviet Union could be playing in this conflict. And when Syria sent some tanks and armored personnel carriers into Jordan, and the numbers are unclear, but he thought, and Nixon, they thought to some extent the Soviets were behind this move by Syria into Jordan, right? And I think that actually the Soviet Union was urging restraint on the Syrians. But that's the way he tended to look at things. He was always very much attuned to what the Soviet Union.
Very much zero sum. What does your reading, your analysis of the Kissinger tapes tell us about his relationship with Nixon? My understanding was that if he didn't patronize Nixon, he certainly, perhaps in some ways, looked down intellectually on him. Is there any truth in that?
Well, actually, in the transcripts, he was constantly deferential to Nixon.
In front of Nixon, but privately. I mean,
oh well, behind his back, he would say some nasty things about him. But to his, in the phone transcripts, he was always very deferential to Nixon. He always addressed him as Mr. President because Nixon. He was always he was always aware of his standing with Nixon. He was insecure about it, which Nixon fed. So he was always, concerned about, how he stood with his boss. And so he was very deferential to him, but behind his back, of course, to say a lot of, critical things about Nixon. But, Nixon and Kissinger didn't really trust each other. They didn't know what they were thinking.
It sound like they trusted, well, certainly Nixon never trusted anyone. Did Kissinger trust anyone? Who was he close to from these tapes?
I think he trusted more people than Nixon did. But
which isn't saying much.
Which is not saying much, right. The people he spends a lot of time with on the phone besides Nixon would be Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird, who he had a rivalry with. I mean, they were both very devious. And they were both master leakers. And I think they came to actually respect each other for their deviousness. But they would, they would say one thing and do something else with each other. But I think they actually came to respect each other for it, because Laird was actually quite clever. Like, he was a former congressman, and he was very good at operating with around people. And I think Kitchener respected that. But they didn't trust each other, and he obviously, this has been talked about a lot. So Kissinger thought very low of the Secretary of State William Rogers, and he was always trashing Rogers behind his back. Kissinger did this with a lot of people. He was very two-faced. He would say something, he'd say one thing to a person and then say something totally different behind their back.
Well, it isn't that unusual, certainly for politicians, is it, Tom?
No, but I think Kissinger did it a lot. I mean, it's just, that's the way he operated. I mean, but I think that's partly his ambition and trying to achieve his goals. And I don't think he was too concerned about that.
What about his private life? In contrast with Zbig, he was very much of a ladies' man around town. Do the Kissinger tapes reveal anything about Henry Kissinger's private life? In our age of Epstein, of course, we seem to be obsessed with sex. What do the Kissinger tapes tell us about what Henry Kissinger got up to outside the office?
Well, he did have these relationships with Hollywood celebrities. That comes up a little bit, but not that much. But I know that he was, he seemed to take great pleasure in his Playboy reputation. This is part of his nightlife. After working these long days, he's going out at night, and often, on these dates. It doesn't come up a lot in the conversations, but he seemed to take great pleasure in it. He liked it. He enjoyed his Playboy reputation. I know he hated it when actresses used him for publicity. I think he was skeptical of what they might do in that regard. He liked to flirt with female journalists. There was a woman for the Washington Post. He seemed to like to flirt with her, Marilyn Berger, but also Barbara Walters. He seemed to kind of have an interest in Barbara Walters.
I think they dated at some point, him and Walters.
Well, I don't know. She was not interested. I mean, there was like some rumors around that she'd left her. She was separated from her husband at one point, and there was rumors that she had left him for Henry Kissinger, and I think Kissinger actually liked those rumors, but she did not at all. She had no, he made a few comments that made me wonder how how interested he was in her. He said something at one point, I know you like to keep he wanted to have coffee with her after an interview. And she said, I don't know, that's awful personal, and he said, well, I know you like to keep your feelings out. And that made me kind of wonder what he was referring to, keeping his feelings out. But she didn't like, there were press reports linking her to Henry Kissinger. And she didn't like those at all because, but she needed access. She needed access to Kissinger. And I think Kissinger enjoyed the fact that he was linked to her publicly.
Tom, next week, I have an interview with Daniel Ellsberg's son, who is the editor of a new book called Truth and Consequences. Ellsberg, of course, the leaker of the Pentagon Papers about Vietnam. Ultimately, you've mentioned Vietnam many times in this conversation on the Kissinger tapes. What do they tell us new about? I mean, so much has been written on American policy in Vietnam, and obviously Nixon and Kissinger. Do these tapes reveal anything new about the American misadventure, the catastrophe?
Yeah, I think they enlighten a lot the divisions inside the administration about the bombing campaigns and when to bomb, who the bombing was directed at, whether the bombing should be focused primarily on North Vietnam or South Vietnam. There were a lot of divisions inside the administration over that, including between Kissinger and Melvin Laird, and Kissinger, and there was a lot of frustration with the U.S. military commander in Vietnam, Creighton Abrams, who also wanted the bombing focused primarily on South Vietnam as opposed to North Vietnam. And there was a lot of talk about whether how the bombing would affect the Soviet summit, and whether we should not bomb because of how it might affect the Soviet summit, or whether we bomb or the Soviets going to pull out of the summit, and how do we calculate all that in relation to the Soviet Union. I mean, there's a high level of detail about the bombing campaigns, when they should be held, when they should be undertaken, who they should target, when they should stop, who are we worried about? There's a lot of strategizing over the bombing. There's a tremendous amount of focus on the invasion of Laos.
Which, understandably, which was another moral catastrophe. Tom, you've noted that Kissinger didn't have any moral concerns with the death of Vietnamese or Laotian or Cambodian civilians. What about on the American side? Did he care about the death? Because many Americans were also being killed under his watch. Well, of course, this catastrophe resulted in previous senior administration figures, McNamara, for example, having nervous breakdown. Did it have any impact on Kissinger? Did he care about American casualties?
I think they saw it as a big political problem.
I think it bothered him that American kids were being killed in Vietnam?
Yeah, I think they looked at it as a major political problem. They wanted to limit American casualties, and they looked at it totally different than Vietnamese casualties.
Where was his heart? Does he have a heart, in your view, Kissinger? Did he care? Is there any kind of examples in the tapes of him being morally outraged?
Occasionally you'll see, I remember at least a couple places he asked about when they're discussing potential bombing campaigns and where they would bomb. And I remember a couple times he asked about, well, how many people would we kill? And he raised the issue, like I said, I remember 2 or 3 times, but the question is he raising it because he's worried about the political fallout of civilian casualties in Vietnam, or is he raising it because he's concerned about the morality? I think he's much more concerned about the political fallout, because you see them elsewhere where they're so callous to these, to the number of people they're killing. So it's hard to believe it's primarily a question of morality. I think they're more concerned about the international repercussions and the public opinion fallout of, killing a lot of civilians.
So it sounds to me, the more you talk about him, and I take your point on his work ethic and his ambition, but there was a monstrous quality to Henry Kissinger, which you seem to be suggesting comes out in these Kissinger tapes.
Yeah, it does. I mean, the lack of morality, lack of consideration for morality and the human cost of these various. I mean, when they were backing Pakistan, who was massacring people in East Pakistan, which later became Bangladesh.
Yeah, the Bangladesh genocide, which I know comes up the
They were secretly getting arms to the Pakistani military dictatorship that was committing these atrocities, and this is a horrible, this is genocide in East Pakistan, and they were secretly getting weapons, against the U.S. arms embargo that was still in place to the Pakistani, military dictatorship. So, I mean, that's how they operate, and they partly because they needed Pakistan for their opening to China. I mean, because Pakistan was a channel to China when they were developing relationship with China. But that's how he looked at it. I mean that's a pretty good example actually that he was the opening to China was much more important to him than the fact that all these people were getting slaughtered.
Right, and just to remind people, in this Bangladesh genocide, there was at least according to Wikipedia, somewhere between 300,000 and 3 million Bengalis were killed, including raping somewhere between 200 and 400,000 Bengali women. So these are terrible numbers. Tom, Hannah Arendt famously wrote about the banality of evil when she was covering the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in the early 60s. Some people have connected Arendt's work on the banality of evil with the behavior of senior bureaucrats or politicians like Kissinger. What's your take? Is there something banal? I don't know whether we should even use the E word with Kissinger.
Well,
was he evil?
I think they get used to carrying out these policies and looking out the other way when it comes to the human toll. And I think it just they almost get immune to it. But I think their goals are just beyond that. I mean, that's not what they're focused on. They're focusing about foreign policy victories and public opinion victories and advancing, American interests in the world and American standing and limiting Soviet influence in the world. And that's far more important to these guys than how many people are dying in Vietnam and how many people are dying in East Pakistan and other places. That's just not how they look at it. They don't.
No, I take your point. But I mean, for moral critics of evil, or an analyst of evil, philosophers of evil, like Hannah Arendt, who wrote about the banality of evil with someone like Eichmann, who claimed to be obeying orders and behaved like a bureaucrat in the mass murder of millions of European Jews. Is there an equivalent with Kissinger and turning a blind eye to the murder of millions of Bangladeshis?
I think he did turn a blind eye to a lot of the killing around the world.
But my question is there an equivalent from?
I'm not sure. I don't know if I could make that comparison. I don't know.
So
but
what?
He certainly turned a blind eye. I mean.
Yeah. So what are the Kissinger tapes? What do they tell us about America in the 2020s? I mean, at some point, maybe someone will come out with the Trump tapes or the Trump files. We'll know more and more about what Donald Trump has said. Are there warnings about America in the 2020s, invasion of Venezuela, brewing war with Iran and Cuba? What does reading the Kissinger tapes inform us about the America of the mid-2020s, America in early 2026?
Well, I think one of the things that they would tell you is you can't that these people are not necessarily telling you the truth, and they might be saying something totally different in their discussions behind closed doors about why they're doing certain things and what they might do and what their goals are. I mean, they're obviously that, Kissinger, these guys are saying one thing and doing something else. And I mean, for example, like during the invasion of Laos, the public line was that things are going well and the South Vietnamese are making advances and they're capturing all this enemy supplies and, that's coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, right? And hopefully preventing an enemy offensive. Whereas in private, they're wringing their hands over what a disaster the invasion is. and why the South Vietnamese are retreating and actually running away as opposed to staying on the offensive. And they're really they're really concerned about, and Kissinger just wringing his hands over this, but in public they're talking about the invasion's going well. So I mean, I think one thing's that these inside conversations, you learn that these people are often not telling you the truth. I mean, I think this is pretty runs through.
Yeah, I think we would be amazed if Donald Trump was any more truthful than Henry Kissinger. Finally, Tom, I know your book, The Kissinger Tapes, covers Kissinger's take on the Yom Kippur War. And of course, Israel, Gaza, Palestine is still a huge issue in the world today, as is Russia and Ukraine. Any sense from reading the Kissinger tapes what Kissinger himself would make of the current situation, either in Ukraine or Gaza?
Well, I'm not sure, but I think that he'd be very much, given his focus on limiting Soviet influence in the world, and I don't know what his position on this stuff was before he died, but I would think he'd be, I would think he'd look at Ukraine as, as a bulwark against the Soviet Union, and he'd probably give arms to the Ukraine, but he'd also be very much.
Well, it's not this. I mean, as you know, it's not the Soviet Union anymore. Was he just fearful of the Russians as opposed to the Soviets?
No, he was fearful of the Soviets. I mean, he was fearful. He wasn't fearful. He just looked at Soviet Union as a rival in the world, and he wanted to limit their influence. I don't think he was ever fearful.
So my question is, as Russia is a kind of rival to the U.S. today in a way, although it's probably not its principal rival, China, of course, more so, particularly over Taiwan. Do you think that the Kissinger doctrine, if Kissinger was around today, I mean, what would he make of Russia's invasion of Ukraine from America's point of view, or for that matter, the growing threat of war in the South China Sea over Taiwan?
I think he'd be both trying to restrain Russia and be trying to restrain China, while at the same time trying to develop good relationships with them.
Well, Tom Wells, the author of the Kissinger Tapes, an important new book out, Inside His Secretly Recorded Phone Conversations, which reveals Henry Kissinger as hardworking, ambitious, callous, and dishonest. Is that a fair generalization, Tom?
I think that'd be a fair synopsis, yeah.
Well, thank you so much, and congratulations. It's an important book, an important contribution. The more we can know about Kissinger, I think the more clarity we can bring to a particularly turbulent period in American history. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.